In today's video, we'll be discussing the lore surrounding the Relic Wars of Foxhole. Foxhole's lore has always been obscure and unknowable, due to the fact that the average player can only hope to stumble upon fragments or hints of a story while fighting on the desolate battlefields of Siva. Sometimes the battlefield environment itself tells a story. In this case, derelict corpses of aircraft litter the battlefield, yet the skies remain eerily silent. Scores of soldiers scavenge the refuse of war for scraps, and of course infighting within factions over every drop of oil. All of these are hints that will help us understand why we're fighting in a Relic War. So together, let's dive into the lore of Foxhole's Relic Wars. Let's start by understanding when the Relic weapons come from. The current player war is happening in the first millennia of Foxhole history. In order to simplify things, we'll say that the current Relic War is happening in approximately the year 1000. First, let's go back to the year 400, where the Warden lands of Siva and the colonial homeland of Masaya are separated by the Warden ally country known as Veli. Veli was a significant trade partner to Siva until the aggressive colonial expansionism began cutting into the territory of Veli. The Sivish people, fearing that they would be the next victims of colonial expansionism, began the construction of a great border wall spanning from sea to sea. This great wall would be known as the Bulwark, and its construction was overseen by then leader of the Wardens, Archon Callahan. The country of Veli, finding itself on the wrong side of the Bulwark, feels abandoned and betrayed by its northern ally, and the populace feels split between joining the colonials or maintaining its current position. The split populace leads to years of Velian civil war, with obvious support from the Wardens and colonials. Fast forward to the year 700, when hundreds of years of border skirmishes, rebellions, and ever-present tensions boil into an all-out war known as the Great War. In the mid-700s, Velian legate Celes Maro successfully breaches the Bulwark. And this era of war in the mid-700s is where the vast majority of relic vehicles come from. This is evidenced by multiple ancient battlegrounds that can be found north of the breach, which are littered with the wrecks of relic vehicles from long-forgotten battles. Another clue as to the timeline of relic vehicles is that the late 700s and early 800s is when the Hanged Men faction began. If you're unfamiliar with the Hanged Men, they're a splinter faction composed of both Warden and colonial deserters who became disenfranchised with the Great War between the Wardens and colonials. This is a clue because the Hanged Men are the ones responsible for hoarding the relic vehicles and weapons in the relic vaults we know of today. But the most solid piece of evidence that we have for the timeline of relic vehicles being from the mid-700s is the vehicle descriptions that we get in-game. The heavy infantry carrier states that whispers of its existence date back to the first breaching. The storm tank description calls it a lightly armored vehicle, first seen in the early border skirmishes between Siva and Veli. This means that it existed long before the breach. However, if you look at the ancient battlefields above the breach, you can see storm tanks alongside heavy infantry carrier wrecks. This means that they were both used during the mid-late 700s. Now that we know the relic vehicles are from the Great War era and are hundreds of years old, we have to ask the bigger question: why? Why are two nations capable of launching missiles that can destroy entire zones interested in using weapons and vehicles from hundreds of years ago? There are two main reasons for this. The first is scarcity of resources. War is incredibly expensive. Here's a real-world example. In the beginning of World War I, Britain was the seat of financial power in the world. After a few years of wartime expenses and making purchases from the American people, the seat of financial power in the world shifted from Great Britain to New York. So we know that a few years of war can be very expensive, so imagine a war that's been raging for hundreds of years. That would be unfathomably expensive. Gameplay mechanics can also clue us into just how desperate things really are. Soldiers are breaking down scraps from old battlefields to recycle and rebuild new vehicles and weapons of war. Not to mention that both factions are desperate enough to mine for oil and sulfur in the same zones they're fighting over. And there's even fighting within factions over the very oil that they mine. Even in the colonial spawn region, you can find a sign detailing that supplies coming from the offshore colonies are dwindling. Desperation for resources is one reason that the colonials and wardens are in a frenzy over finding caches of relic vehicles to fight with. The second reason that the nations are frantically raiding relic vaults is that the relic vehicles and weapons have some particular advantages over current models. Many of these relic vehicles were made hundreds of years ago when these two factions were considerably richer, and so they're made with significantly more durable alloys and metals. The heavy infantry carrier description states that its hull was reinforced with alloys now lost to time. Aside from the vehicle descriptions, the lore shows how our modern military engineers are confounded by the power and mechanisms of the rifles and machine guns found within the relic vaults. In this lore piece in the Drowned Vale, an engineer is consistently unable to understand the power of these relic weapons, and has broken 3 tripods by simply test firing them. Sort of makes sense when you look at the size of that relic machine gun. Aside from using relic weapons and vehicles outright on the battlefield, repurposing old forgotten tech due to resource scarcity and quality reasons is not a new concept. One example is the developer description of the Kingspire scout tank, which states that it was an old forgotten tank from a previous era that was repurposed for modern use. It's also notable that the hull of the HIC is strikingly similar to that of the Ares super heavy tank, and the Colonial train combat car is compared directly to the Phalanx relic tank. So now you have an understanding of where and when the relic vehicles come from. They're from hundreds of years ago and were used in the time of the breaching of the bulwark in the mid-700s. And you have a better understanding of why we're desperate to get our hands on military relics from hundreds of years ago, mainly due to extreme scarcity of resources and the fact that these relic weapons are very powerful and made of higher quality alloys lost to time. Before I finish this video, I want to give a massive shout out to One-Eyed Dragon for helping me iron out some of the history and lore pieces in this video. Also, a massive shout out to the patrons Alpha Jingus, 07 Ace, Freddy, Obamna, Dwentay, and boyoFPS for helping me upgrade my microphone. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I'm making weekly videos. Please like and comment for the algorithm. Join the Discord, link in description, but you'll probably regret that. Thank you to our generous patrons for funding this video, and most importantly, have a good day.